Hey, welcome to our channel. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss our latest content.
It wasn't a night for fireworks, or thunder, or the kind of dramatic pronouncements that marked the end of an era. It was a Tuesday. An aggressively ordinary Tuesday, the kind that blends into the wallpaper of a life. Utterly forgettable. That, I think, is what made it so cruel. The scent of roasted garlic and rosemary still hung in the air, a testament to the dinner I'd carefully prepared. I watched Thea across our new oak table, the one we'd spent 3 weekends searching for. She swirled the last of the Cabernet in her glass, her eyes catching the soft glow of the pendant light above. She looked beautiful, effortlessly so, and then she dropped the bomb. She did it with the same casual tone she might use to comment on the weather, or to mention we were out of milk. "I'm planning a trip through Europe," she said, looking not at me, but into the deep red vortex in her glass. "With Emma and Clara." My fork stopped, a millimeter from my lips. Time itself seemed to pause, the ambient hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the universe. I'm sure it was only for a second, maybe two, but it felt like an eternity. I willed my muscles to move, to complete the motion, to pretend the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. I chewed a piece of roasted potato that had suddenly turned to ash in my mouth. She pretended not to notice. Of course she did. "Oh?" I managed, the single syllable feeling like a monumental effort. "That sounds amazing." "For how long?" My voice was a stranger's, a polite automaton. Inside, a cold knot was tightening in my chest, a chilling premonition. And then she spoke, and the words flowed out of her not like a conversation, but like a declaration. A torrent of pent-up dreams I hadn't known existed. She talked of the cobblestone streets of Prague, of seeing the Mona Lisa without a crowd if they could just get there early enough. She spoke of the freedom of a train ticket with no fixed destination, of tapas in Barcelona, of watching the sunset over the canals in Venice. Her eyes were bright, alight with a fervor I hadn't seen in years. Not for me, anyway. The more she talked, the more the knot in my chest constricted, squeezing the air from my lungs. This wasn't a trip, this was an escape. I knew her. After 7 years, I knew the subtle architecture of her evasions. I knew the way her gaze would drift to the left when she was hiding something significant. I knew the specific, airy pitch her voice adopted when she was trying to sell a story, mostly to herself. She wasn't just planning to see the world, she was planning to leave ours behind. Outwardly, I maintained a mask of serene support. I nodded. I smiled. I even asked a question about their itinerary. But inside, the very foundations of the life we had just cemented were cracking. Images flickered through my mind like a faulty projector. Signing the mortgage papers, our hands brushing. The dizzying smell of fresh paint in the bedroom, arguing playfully over which sofa to buy. The moving boxes, still stacked in the spare room, filled with the promise of a future. A future that, apparently, only I had subscribed to. That night didn't end in a fight. It would have been easier if it had. A fight would have been an engagement, a battle for something shared. This was worse. This was an abdication. I refused to turn her announcement into a war of accusations. What was the point? So I just listened. I let her talk until she had exhausted her excitement, until the river of words slowed to a trickle. I noted every hesitation, every forced smile when she mentioned how much she would miss this. She avoided my eyes during the most important parts. She looked at her plate, her glass, the salt shaker, anything but the man to whom she had promised to build a life. I knew then, confronting her would be useless. This wasn't a proposal she was making. It was a verdict she was delivering. She had already made her decision, alone, in some quiet corner of her heart. This was merely the courtesy of an announcement. So, in an act of maturity that felt like it was tearing my pride to shreds, I remained silent on the matter of us. I swallowed the lump in my throat, which now felt as large and heavy as a stone. I smiled, a pained, unconvincing thing. "It sounds like the adventure of a lifetime," I said, the words tasting like poison. "You should absolutely do it." I told her I supported her search for new horizons, when all I felt was the abyssal fear of losing the only horizon I had ever wanted. But in that moment of surrender, something else happened. Deep within the soil of my devastation, a tiny, defiant seed began to sprout, a seed of change, a seed of self-preservation. Later that night, long after Thea's steady breathing filled the silence of our bedroom, I sat alone in the living room. The moonlight streamed through the large window, illuminating the ghost of our shared dream. This life we had built. It was comfortable. It was successful. but it felt fragile, like a beautiful glass sculpture with a hairline fracture running through it. I opened my laptop. The soft glow of the screen felt like a single point of clarity in a sea of confusion. There was no impulsiveness in my actions. The pain was a wildfire, but my mind had become a cold, calculating firebreak. I planned everything with precision. A new bank account, in my name only. A scheduled, recurring transfer from our joint savings, redirecting a portion of my salary, small enough to go unnoticed. For now, a consultation with my lawyer, booked for Friday. The subject line was vague. Financial planning. He would understand. Each click of the keyboard was a quiet rebellion, a small act of defiance against the pain that threatened to consume me. If Thea was seeking her freedom, then I had to secure my own, not just emotionally, but financially. I would not be the man left standing in the rubble, wondering what hit him. I would not be the last one to know that the story had ended. While Thea dreamt of European sunrises, I was quietly sketching the blueprint of my own new dawn. I knew this was just the beginning. Her announcement wasn't the earthquake. It was the first, faint tremor that signals the coming cataclysm. But I made a promise to myself in the quiet dark of that house. I would not beg. I would not plead for a love that was already packing its bags. If she had decided to leave, I would let her go, and I would find a way to move forward, too, even if it cost me every certainty I had ever held in my heart. Even if love itself had to be left behind. Like so many other things life had already taught me to let go of. As the clock on the mantelpiece ticked away the final minutes of that ordinary Tuesday, I closed the laptop. I walked up the stairs, my feet heavy on the steps we had climbed together just a few hours before. I paused at our bedroom door, watching her. She was so peaceful in her sleep, so distant, a stranger lying in my bed. I thought of everything. Lazy Sunday mornings, the small, silly arguments, the comfortable silences, the thousand tiny threads that weave a partnership together. And in the stillness, I said goodbye, not to the woman sleeping there, but to the idea of her I had held. Goodbye to the us that was still physically present, but whose spirit had already departed for another time, another place. A version of herself I was beginning to realize I may never have truly known at all. Without a sound, I lay down beside her, the cold, vast space between us on the mattress feeling like an unbridgeable chasm. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and knew, with a certainty that chilled my soul, that our marriage, though still standing on the outside, had already begun to crumble from within, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The days leading up to her departure were a masterclass in surrealism. We moved around each other with a strange, delicate choreography of avoidance. Thea packed her bags with the breezy lightness of someone preparing for a grand adventure. She laid out sweaters and travel guides on the bed we shared, her energy bright and forward-facing. I, on the other hand, watched her every move as if I were reading the final chapter of a book whose ending I already knew. There was no drama. No tearful goodbyes, just a perfunctory kiss on my forehead at the airport gate and an empty promise to stay in touch. "I'll miss you," she said, but her eyes were already looking past me, toward the security line, toward the freedom that awaited her. "Have an amazing time," I replied, my voice steady. And just like that, she was gone. In the first few hours after her departure, the silence in the house was a physical presence. It was a heavy blanket, smothering everything. Her absence was in every room. In the indentation her head left on her pillow, in the half-empty mug of coffee she'd left on the counter. Still, I remained firm. I had a plan. My decision was to observe, not to interfere, not to pressure, just to watch. It was my own quiet way of protecting what was left of my heart from any further disappointment. Thea's social media became my painful, private window into a world that no longer included me. It was a curated reality, designed to showcase a specific narrative. She posted almost every day. First, a smiling photo, in front of the Eiffel Tower, holding a glass of wine, with Emma and Clara flanking her. The caption read, "Finally breathing." Then, a video of her walking along the Seine, laughing with strangers, the wind in her hair. She looked happier than I had seen her in years. She looked like a woman unburdened. A woman set free. I looked at every post, every story, in the silent darkness of my living room. Each image seemed carefully crafted to convey a message of liberation, of renewal. And even though I knew it was a form of self-torture, something inside me needed to see it. I needed to understand. I needed to accept. It was in one of those posts, a candid shot of her group laughing at a cafe in Montmartre, that something small but devastating caught my eye. Ringfinger. It was bare. For 7 years, that simple, slender band of white gold had been a permanent fixture on her hand. It had symbolized everything we had built. It had been there through financial struggles, through family illnesses, through celebrations, and through the 1,000 unremarkable days that make up a life. Now, in a city full of stories, she had set it aside as if it were a costume piece she was tired of wearing. I zoomed in on the picture, my thumb trembling slightly on the screen. The pixels blurred, but there was no mistaking the bareness of her skin. Maybe she had just forgotten it, I told myself. A foolish, desperate thought. Maybe she'd taken it off to wash her hands and it was in her pocket. But deep down, I knew better. It was a symbol. A silent, screaming declaration from someone who had already decided to let go. The details began to pile up, each one a small, sharp piece of glass in a wound that wouldn't close. In a photo from Rome, she posed with a group of tourists, her head thrown back in an exaggerated laugh. An unknown man's hand rested casually, possessively, on the small of her back. In Barcelona, a blurry picture from a crowded bar showed her dancing with a man with long, dark hair, their faces dangerously close, her eyes closed in a moment of pure abandon. I saved each image, each fragment of a story that, though still subtle to an outsider, was writing its own ending for me. A deep, cold sorrow grew inside me, fed with every click, every like, every comment I read on her posts. Messages from friends and strangers alike, praising her. You look so free. This is your glow-up era. So happy for you. No one mentioned the husband waiting at home. The man who still watered the plants she'd bought, who still sorted the mail addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Elias Thorne. The man who was grieving a marriage that everyone else thought was on a temporary vacation. One night, unable to sleep, I scrolled back through weeks of her posts. I was a detective searching for clues to a crime I had already solved. In a photo from Florence, I saw him again, the man from the Barcelona bar. He was in the background, partially obscured, but it was him. Then again in a group shot from a winery in Tuscany. A travel acquaintance, perhaps? Or something more. At that moment, a strange sense of calm washed over me. I realized I didn't need to know the specifics. It didn't matter if his name was Marco or Jean-Pierre. What mattered was what was right in front of my eyes. The woman I loved was walking a path that no longer had any space for my name. Even then, I stuck to my decision. I didn't send a single accusatory message. I didn't make one desperate phone call. I kept my pain to myself, a silent soldier who understands that some battles are already lost before the first shot is even fired. During one particularly long, sleepless night, a memory pierced through the fog of my grief with the force of an arrow. We were still dating, sitting on a park bench on a crisp autumn afternoon. The leaves were turning gold and red around us. Thea had turned to me, her expression earnest and open. If one day you get lost, she had said, her eyes locked on mine, I promise I'll come find you. And if I get lost, I hope you'll find me. I smiled sadly in the darkness of my empty house. I had searched for her. I had searched for her in every forced smile before she left, in every empty platitude, in every carefully curated photograph. But Thea didn't want to be found. She wanted to get lost. And I was beginning to accept that maybe true love isn't about chasing someone who has chosen to leave. Maybe, just maybe, it's about having the strength and the self-respect to know when to stop running. Still, every new post felt like a silent blow. Not of anger, but of sadness. A deep, quiet sadness for the loss of something I had believed was unshakable. While Thea's world seemed to be expanding without limits, mine was shrinking, becoming more intimate, more real. Without realizing it, I was beginning to grieve a relationship that, though still existing on paper, had already died in her heart. And when morning came, bringing a new wave of bright, carefree posts from somewhere in Greece, I simply took a deep breath, saved another screenshot to the secret folder on my computer labeled evidence, and moved on with my day. I knew there was more to face, but I also knew that with each passing day, I was one step closer to making the hardest, and perhaps most necessary, choice of my entire life. When Thea walked back through the front door 3 weeks later, the smile on her face carried an almost cruel lightness. She dragged her suitcases inside, the wheels rumbling on the hardwood floor, and spoke about her trip as if she were returning from a long, relaxing vacation. There was no weight in her words, no hesitation in her movements. She was a tourist in her own home. For me, every sentence she spoke, every anecdote she shared, was just confirmation. The distance between us wasn't just geographical anymore. It had become irreversible. Still, I remained calm. I was like someone who had already read the book and was simply waiting for the final, inevitable rituals to play out. She left her suitcases in the hallway and walked into the kitchen, presumably for a glass of water, and that's when she saw it. The envelope was impossible to miss. White, rectangular, and stark against the dark wood of the dining table. It rested there like a final statement, a farewell note without a single handwritten word. She noticed it immediately, but she ignored it for a few minutes. A flicker of something unease, perhaps, crossed her face before she masked it. She continued to talk, telling me a disjointed story about a hidden restaurant she'd found in Lisbon. Her words sounded hollow, echoing in a house where love no longer lived. I let her finish. When she finally paused, taking a sip of water, I simply nodded toward the table. Her gaze followed mine and hesitated. For the first time since she had walked through the door, Thea lost control of the narrative. She picked up the envelope as if it might burn her. She tore open the flap with an uncharacteristic roughness and slid the papers out. I watched as her eyes scanned the lines. Her confident, sun-kissed composure began to crumble. Official documents, legal letterhead, my offer to buy her share of the house, fair market value, prepared by my lawyer, a proposed division of our shared assets, meticulously detailed, and a confirmation that a moving service had been scheduled, a service I would pay for, to help her transport her belongings wherever she chose. Shock registered on her face, raw and unfiltered. It was the look of someone who hadn't considered, for even a moment, that I would act with such clarity and determination. She had expected a fight, or tears, or pleading. She had not expected a business transaction. Elias, she stammered, her voice losing its breezy confidence. What is this? Don't you think we're being a little hasty? We should talk about this. We can solve things calmly. She was reaching for the emergency brake on a train that had already left the station. I cut her off, my voice even and quiet, devoid of the bitterness that was churning inside me. You sought freedom, Thea, I said, meeting her panicked gaze without flinching. I'm offering it to you. There was no accusation, no anger, just the quiet certainty of a man who had finally understood his own worth. Is this final? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I simply nodded. I explained the terms. I would assume the mortgage. The house we had chosen together, where every wall held the ghost of a shared dream, would now be mine alone. She, who had sought new paths, would now have the freedom to walk one without the burden of a past she so clearly didn't want to preserve. She tried to resist then. She started to cry. She spoke of the first night we spent in this house, on an air mattress on the living room floor, making plans to paint the room that was supposed to be for our future child. She reminded me of lazy afternoons spent reading in the garden. Beautiful words. Meaningless words. They had come far too late. I listened to it all in silence. Not because I didn't care about those memories, I did. They were a part of me, but because I understood that remembering the good moments didn't erase the bad choices. I refused to be a prisoner of a past she had already abandoned. Without raising my voice, I gently explained the logistics. The moving truck will be here in 2 days. On Saturday morning, you have until then to organize what you want to take. I've already started separating your things to make it easier. No emotional bargaining. No last-ditch attempts at reconciliation. What had existed between us was unraveling right there, in our sunlit kitchen, without noise, without an audience. It was ending with the quiet dignity of someone who understands that there are things that, no matter how painful, need to be left behind. She cried. Silent tears streamed down her face as she tried to find the words to reverse the inevitable. But I didn't give in. Not out of coldness, but out of self-respect. After everything I had seen, after every photo, every absent ring, every silent message she had broadcast to the world, I had learned a fundamental truth. Loving someone is not enough when that person has already chosen not to stay. That night, she slowly climbed the stairs to the bedroom that would soon no longer be hers. I stayed in the living room, looking around at the house that now seemed vast and empty, but which I knew would become the cradle of my new beginning. And there, in that heavy, pregnant silence, I understood that sometimes, the greatest act of love you can give yourself is having the courage to close a door that has been left open for someone who never learned how to value the home on the other side. The morning the moving truck arrived, it parked right in front of the house, its large, white form obscuring the view of the street. I watched from the living room window, a mug of coffee growing cold in my hands. The scene felt strangely distant, as if I were a spectator watching a movie about someone else's life, a story that no longer belonged to me. Thea hurried down the stairs, her eyes puffy and red. She avoided my gaze, focusing on directing the movers with a clipped, minimal involvement, as if rushing to leave a place where she no longer found shelter. As the men began loading boxes and furniture, her books, her art supplies, the armchair she had loved, I remained seated. I looked at the table where we had laughed, at the couch where we had fallen asleep watching movies that promised happy endings that didn't exist in the real world. The hours passed with the same bitter slowness of a formal goodbye to something that had already been dead for months. When the last box was loaded, Thea stood in the open doorway for a moment. The house behind her was full of empty spaces and echoes. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a complicated mixture of regret and sadness. I simply gave a slight, final nod. No more words were spoken. No promises of reunion were made. She closed the door for the last time. It was the end. Simple, quiet, and devastating. In the first few days, the emptiness was a roar. The sound of my own footsteps on the hardwood floors seemed unnervingly loud. Each room seemed to hold the ghost of the life we had planned. Yet, I knew this was where my reconstruction had to begin. I hadn't fled. I hadn't sought a new address to erase the memories. I chose to stay. I chose to transform them. Practically speaking, I started redecorating. I took down the photos that adorned the walls, us smiling in various locations, a timeline of a love that had expired. It wasn't an act of anger, but of necessity, like a farmer clearing a field to prepare the soil for a new planting. I sold the couch we had bought together and bought a smaller, leather one that was entirely my own choice. The bed came next. Slowly, methodically, I began to fill the house with objects that carried only my history, my story. The old acoustic guitar that had been stored in a closet for years came back to life, its case opened in a corner of the living room. An old film camera, forgotten on a shelf, was polished and given a place of pride on the mantelpiece. I was rediscovering pleasures I had allowed to go dormant. I enrolled in a black and white photography class at the local cultural center, something I had always dreamed of doing but for which I'd never found the time. I rediscovered the simple, meditative joy of cooking for one, of going for long walks with no destination, of sitting in a cafe for hours, simply observing the world around me. On one of those solitary days, while working in the small front garden, pulling up weeds, I met Mrs. Henderson. She was a woman with a cloud of white hair and an easy smile, who lived 2 houses down. She saw me struggling with a stubborn patch of ivy, and without asking permission, came over with a trowel and a small bag of seeds. "These are lavender," she said, her voice warm and crinkly. "They take a while to get started, but they're stubborn. They'll come back every year, stronger than the last." It was the kind of gesture that seemed insignificant in a world of grand, sweeping dramas. But for me, it was a powerful reminder that life always finds a way to bloom, often where you least expect it. Mrs. Henderson, with her simple, earthy wisdom, taught me the patience that only gardeners know. Each brief encounter with her was a small lesson, a silent proof that fresh starts are made of patience, care, and above all, courage. At the same time, I began reaching out to other neighbors, something I had rarely done during my marriage. I accepted an invitation to a neighborhood barbecue. I joined an impromptu poker game. Gradually, the circle of people around me expanded, creating a new, gentle support network I never imagined building. Through this process, I realized that the loneliness I had feared so much wasn't an enemy. It was, in fact, the blank canvas I needed to paint a new life. I was no longer defined by the role of husband, by a shared house, by promises made and broken. I was simply Elias, a man with scars, yes, but who was learning to see them not as open wounds, but as marks of survival. I also came to understand that freedom wasn't about wandering aimlessly through the world, as Thea had believed. True freedom was the ability to be who you are, right where you are, without needing to lose yourself to please anyone else. And that was what I was building, day by day, with small but powerful gestures. Every corner of the house began to reflect my new phase. The colors on the walls changed. The photographs that now filled the frames were landscapes I had captured, simple moments of light and shadow that now held immense value. The mornings were quiet but not heavy. The nights were solitary but not empty. There was peace where once there had been frustrated expectations. And in a slow, almost imperceptible way, I began to see myself again. Not the Elias molded by someone else's needs, not the man who compromised, who postponed his dreams, who silently accepted emotional crumb, but the Elias who laughed out loud at a funny passage in a book, who felt a quiet pride in every new dish he learned to cook, who found profound beauty in the small lavender shoots beginning to push through the soil in his garden. The house, once a symbol of a future that never materialized, was now the home I was building with my own hands, with my own story. And although some nights were still haunted by memories that insisted on hurting, I knew I was on the right path. I didn't need grand adventures in foreign cities to find myself. It was enough to just keep planting, day after day, the life I wanted to harvest. Every detail of this new journey was a silent reaffirmation that I was finally the master of my own story. And despite everything I had lost, something much greater, and far more valuable, was now beginning to bloom. Myself. Weeks had passed, melting into a quiet rhythm. My new routine had become comfortable, filled with small projects, occasional evenings with my new neighborhood friends, and long, reflective walks with my camera. The weight of the separation, though still present, had become lighter. It was a scar now, not a wound, a part of my history that hurt less with each new day. I could breathe more easily. I could walk through the house without every corner whispering painful memories. I was beginning to find a quiet beauty in my own company, something I had believed I'd lost years ago. It was on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that now defined my peaceful existence, that the news hit me like a bolt of lightning from a clear blue sky. I was at a cafe downtown, catching up with an old friend, Mark. We were talking about work, about a recent hiking trip he'd taken, and then, unsure of how to broach the subject, he just said it. He dropped the sentence into the conversation as if he were commenting on the coffee. "Hey, this is awkward, but I heard Thea's pregnant." For a few seconds, the world went silent. The clatter of cups, the murmur of conversations around us, it all faded away. I thought I had misheard him. I swallowed hard, forcing an uncomfortable smile as my brain struggled to process the word. My mind spun. 1,000 questions erupted at once. How? When? Why? And the most important, most terrifying one of all, whose? Thea hadn't contacted me at all since the day she moved out. No messages, no calls, not even a timid email. To learn now, through a third party, that she was carrying a new life inside her, it ripped open the scar I thought was healing. The cruelest doubt settled in immediately. What if? What if the timing was possible? What if, despite everything, there was one last, inescapable bond between us? The idea of a child, my child, being born into the chaos of our separation, was a torment I couldn't bear. For a day, I tried to ignore it. I told myself to let it go, to continue on the path I had forged, to not get entangled in the next chapter of Thea's life. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't find peace without an answer. I needed to hear it from her. That night, after pacing the length of my living room for what felt like hours, I finally picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over her name in my contacts list, a name I hadn't deleted. I dialed the number I still knew by heart. Each ring felt like a heavy blow against my ribs. When she finally answered, her voice was distant, almost indifferent. "Hello?" I didn't beat around the bush. There was no room for pleasantries. "Thea," I said, my own voice tight. "It's Elias. I heard about the pregnancy. I just need to know." I trailed off, unable to form the full question. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, heavy as lead. Then, with the same cold clarity she'd shown when she'd left, she responded. "You can rest assured, Elias," she said. "The child isn't yours." The reply was dry, definitive. It was a clean cut, severing the last, hopeful thread I didn't even know I was still clinging to, buried deep in some forgotten corner of my heart. "Okay," I said, the word feeling strange and hollow in my throat. "Thank you." I hung up. I stood there in the middle of my quiet house, holding the phone, staring into the void. I felt a sadness that transcended pride, or resentment, or even the relief I was supposed to feel. It was a profound, human sadness. A sadness for something that had never been mine, but that now carried the weight of a life. A child would come into the world, born from the echoes of our unresolved story. A child who would grow up hearing some distorted version of what happened between us. A child who might feel the absence of something they never even knew. It was a silent, bitter grief, because even though our story was over, I was still human. I was still capable of caring. But there, standing among the ruins of what I once dreamed would be a family, I also understood something vital, Some answers don't bring relief. Some truths only confirm what you already know deep in your soul. Certain chapters need to be closed completely, without looking back. I put the phone down on the table. I closed the door on that final memory, the one that had insisted on staying slightly ajar, and I decided, once and for all, to move forward. There was nothing more I could do for Thea, nor for the life she was now building without me. What remained, what always remained, was my own path. A path that was lonely at times, but true. A path I would now walk with steady steps, even if my heart still carried the scars that would take a long, long time to become nothing more than old stories, told silently, only to myself. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next.